The feast hall was alive with laughter, warm with burning gold and spilled wine. But in the shadows behind the ancient tapestry, Sophie stood entirely still. She listened to her fated mate joke about how easily she would accept being hidden away forever. By sunrise, she was gone. Hours before the keep descended into that drunken roar, the eastern wing of the castle had been perfectly, flawlessly silent. Sophie Thorne sat on the edge of a narrow, wool-draped cot in her dimly lit quarters. The chamber was small, tucked away in the forgotten corridors of the northern keep of Ashenir, far from the grand hearths of the high-born guests. It was cold here. The biting chill of the autumn solstice pressed against the frosted glass of her single window, painting spidery patterns of ice along the heavy iron frame. The wind outside howled, a lonely, desperate sound that whipped the snow against the stone walls, but inside her room the silence was absolute. She did not mind the cold. She had spent a lifetime learning how to survive the frost. In her lap lay a small block of rich, dark ironwood. Her fingers, roughened by years of relentless domestic labor and quiet survival, gripped a small steel carving knife. She worked the blade with meticulous, deliberate care. A ribbon of wood curled away from the sharp edge, falling to the cold stone floor to join a growing pile of fragrant ironwood shavings. The air in the small room smelled earthy and clean, a stark contrast to the heavy, perfumed musk that choked the upper levels of the castle. She was carving a wooden wolf. It was not a grand gift. It possessed no glittering jewels, no silver inlays, and held absolutely no political weight in a court that valued gold above loyalty. It was merely a protective totem. It was shaped by the careful, enduring devotion of an Omega, who understood the quiet language of the forest. The figurine was small enough to fit inside a steel gauntlet, designed to rest flush against the pulse point of a warrior's wrist. She smoothed her thumb over the rough curve of the carved beast's neck. The wood was warm from the friction of her skin. She traced the tiny, etched lines that represented the wolf's thick fur, feeling the uneven calluses on her own palms drag against the grain. Her hands were a map of unseen labor, the burn mark on her left wrist from hauling boiling water for the high-born courts, the permanent red chap on her knuckles from scrubbing the ash out of the grand fireplaces before dawn. The evening of the autumn solstice feast had arrived. It was meant to be the time of claiming. The evening Julian Sterling, the sovereign ruler of Ashenir, would formally present his fated mate to the realm. Her chest tightened painfully at the mere thought of him. Just the memory of his name sent a low, humming electric shock through the sacred thread woven between their souls. Julian, a man built of terrifying authority and suppressed violence. A monarch who wore an iron crown that seemed to drain the very warmth from his bones, leaving him isolated on a throne of untouchable power. Every healer, seer, and elder in the kingdom had whispered that his inner beast was unhinged. They said he was driven half-mad by the heavy burden of his warring lineage. They claimed that no one could touch him without risking his explosive, lethal wrath. They did not know what she knew. They did not know how his massive, terrifying frame would go entirely rigid when she stood near him. They did not know the way his storm-grey eyes would track her quiet, unassuming movements across a crowded room. They did not see the violent storm in his gaze, softening into molten gold for a single fleeting heartbeat when he thought no one else was watching. When he was drowning in the deafening noise of his own court, plagued by the endless demands of his advisors, she would simply stand beside his chair. She would not speak. She would not demand his attention or ask for favors. She merely offered her presence, a quiet, grounding anchor in a world of teeth and politics. And in response, the terrifying sovereign would breathe, slowly, deeply, his wild, feral wolf settling into a heavy, exhausted peace that only her specific, fated scent could provide. She pressed the carving knife into the wood again, shaping the sharp, alert ears of the miniature wolf. Her inner wolf whimpered softly in the back of her mind, a restless, instinctual vibration of hope. She had spent the last 3 months living in the extreme periphery of his life, a shadow in his massive keep, a girl of low birth, possessing no dowry, no lands, and no noble alliances to fortify his borders, The courtiers routinely mocked her drab, grey wool dresses. The serving maids whispered cruel, biting jokes in the corridors about the silent, foolish Omega, who dared to think a ruler would actually claim her. But the mate bond did not care about noble blood. The bond was a biological absolute. It was a truth written in the marrow of their bones, a primal mandate that defied the petty rules of court politics. She wiped a stray curl of dark hair from her forehead. She lacked the refined, painted beauty of the high-born guests who paraded through the royal gardens draped in silken jewels. Yet Julian had looked at her, really looked at her. Just a few more cuts, she whispered to the empty room, her breath plumbing in the freezing air. The sound of her own voice felt startlingly loud in the oppressive silence of the chamber. She set the steel knife down on the small wooden table beside her cot and blew the remaining dust from the wooden figure. It was finished. The wooden wolf stood proud and silent in her scarred palm, its carved eyes seeming to watch her with a fierce, protective loyalty. She reached for a scrap of soft, clean linen she had saved for this exact purpose. She wrapped the small figurine with painstaking care, ensuring the wood was entirely protected, and tucked it deep into the pocket of her modest woolen gown. The hour was rapidly approaching. The distant, booming sound of heavy iron bells echoed through the vast stone corridors of the keep, signaling the commencement of the grand feast. The deep vibrations travelled through the ancient floorboards, settling deep into the marrow of her bones and causing her pulse to race. She walked slowly toward the small, tarnished bronze mirror hanging above her cracked wash basin. The reflection staring back at her was pale, composed, and strikingly stark. Her unique silver eyes were wide, betraying a frantic flicker of nervous anticipation. She smoothed the front of her simple dress, her hands trembling slightly. She had no silk to drape over her shoulders, no silver embroidery to make her look like a queen. She had only her quiet dignity, her straight spine, and the unwavering truth of the fated mark that pulsed with a dull, heavy heat on her collarbone. She took a slow, deep breath, letting the freezing ambient air fill her lungs and cool her racing blood. It was time. She would find him in the grand hall. She would give him the carving. She would let the small, hand-crafted totem speak the profound words she had kept locked behind her teeth for months. A promise of sanctuary, a vow of unconditional peace. She turned away from the cracked mirror, pulled her thin grey shawl tightly around her shoulders, and walked out into the dark, echoing corridor. The descent through the northern keep was a jarring study in extremes. The upper levels where she had been housed were freezing, abandoned, and utterly quiet, haunted only by the whistling wind. But as she moved downward, following the sweeping spiral of the ancient stone steps, the ambient temperature began to rise drastically. As she crossed the threshold into the lower halls, the brutal chill snapped. The rigid field of goosebumps lifting the fine hairs on her arms slowly smoothed out in the sudden, suffocating wave of humid heat. The shallow frozen plumes of her breath dissolved instantly into the spiced, heavily perfumed air. The heavy, suffocating scent of roasting meats, dark wine, and burning pine wood drifted upward, thick enough to taste on the back of her tongue. Her senses, heightened to a painful degree by the raw biological tension of the mate bond, meticulously mapped the geography of the castle. She could hear the chaotic clatter of silver platters echoing from the sprawling kitchens. She could smell the expensive, overpowering perfumes of the visiting lords. Heavy musk, crushed red roses, and the sharp, metallic tang of drawn swords clanking against polished armor. A passing servant boy, carrying a towering silver tray of empty golden goblets, nearly collided with her on the narrow landing. He did not pause to apologize. He merely sneered at her simple grey dress, muttered a curse under his breath, and hurried past. She did not flinch. She simply adjusted her path, her face a mask of serene calm. Sophie was very good at being unseen. It was a critical survival tactic she had perfected over a brutal lifetime of being treated as entirely disposable. You learned to step lightly on creaking floorboards. You learned to flatten yourself against the cold masonry when powerful, angry people walked past. You learned to hold your breath, lower your gaze, and make yourself as physically small as possible to avoid drawing the ire of those with teeth. But this evening, she told herself fiercely, she would not be small. She reached into her deep pocket, her scarred fingers curling instinctively around the wrapped linen. The solid, hard shape of the wooden wolf grounded her spiraling anxiety. It was a tangible, physical reminder of the quiet, unguarded moments she had shared with the monarch. She remembered the night he had found her in the royal library, long after the midnight bells had chimed. She had been sitting on the dusty floor, reading an old text by the flickering light of a single tallow candle. He had walked in unannounced, his heavy combat armor covered in the freezing, dark blood of a rogue pack. He had looked utterly terrifying, a monster ripped straight from the kingdom's darkest legends, but he had not roared. He had not demanded subservience. He had simply collapsed into a heavy oak chair, letting his head fall back against the wood, his breathing ragged and shallow. She hadn't run away in terror like the other maids would have. She had quietly stood up, poured him a simple iron cup of hot water from the hearth kettle, and placed it on the table beside his hand. She hadn't asked him about the blood. She hadn't looked at him with revulsion or fear. She had simply existed in the same space, offering him a rare pocket of absolute, non-judgmental silence. He had opened his slate-colored eyes then, looking at her with a raw, bleeding vulnerability that had completely stolen the breath from her lungs. That was the man she was walking toward now, not the terrifying monarch, not the cruel ruler of Ashena, but the exhausted, lonely warrior who desperately needed a safe hearth. The grand hallway leading directly to the feast hall was lined with towering marble statues of past kings, their stone eyes staring down in harsh judgment. The flickering, golden light of the massive wall torches cast long, imposing shadows across the polished flagstones. The noise ahead was a physical wall of overwhelming sound. Upbeat, raucous laughter, booming, aggressive shouting. The heavy, rhythmic thud of wooden tankards slamming against thick oak tables. She paused at the very edge of the golden light, hovering in the safety of the corridor's gloom. The fated mark resting on her collarbone suddenly flared to life. It was a sharp, sudden spike of burning golden heat, erupting against the winter ice of the stone corridor, making her gasp out loud. It felt exactly as though a molten gold ember had been pressed directly against her freezing skin, a violent biological contrast that left her reeling. He was close. She could feel him with absolute biological certainty. The instinctual pull of the bond was undeniable, a magnetic, invisible force dragging her forward against her own hesitation. She took a deliberate step out of the shadows, her chin lifted high, her spine perfectly straight. The main entrance to the grand hall was heavily guarded and choked with visiting dignitaries, wealthy merchants, and drunken nobles draped in finery. She knew better than to attempt walking through the center doors. The mocking whispers and cruel laughter would begin before she even reached the middle of the room, stripping her of her dignity before she could even spot him. Instead, she moved gracefully and silently toward the eastern gallery. It was a narrow, elevated stone walkway that overlooked the private balcony, where the High Council often convened during celebrations to escape the noise of the main floor. The air here was remarkably different. It was thick with the scent of crackling ozone, cold iron, and raw, unrestrained sovereign power. She slipped behind an ancient, massive tapestry depicting the violent founding of the kingdom. The heavy velvet fabric was thick with decades of accumulated dust, smelling strongly of old age, damp stone, and forgotten history. It provided the perfect, impenetrable cover. She stood perfectly still, pressing her back against the freezing wall, letting her breathing slow to a shallow, rhythmic cadence to avoid making a single sound. From her hidden vantage point, she could clearly see the private balcony through a narrow, decorative slit in the stone architecture. The balcony was brilliantly illuminated by the golden, shifting glow of a massive iron brazier, and there he stood, Julian Sterling. He was wearing a formal, tailored tunic of midnight black, adorned with heavy silver clasps that caught the firelight with every subtle movement. The formidable iron crown rested heavy on his dark hair. a stark symbol of his absolute authority. He was beautiful in the way a freshly sharpened blade was beautiful, sharp, dangerous, completely unyielding, and utterly cold. Her inner wolf purred, a deep, resonant, instinctual sound of pure, unadulterated devotion. She took a tiny step forward, her hand tightening around the wooden wolf in her pocket. She prepared to step out from behind the heavy tapestry, to cross the short distance of the balcony, and finally present her gift to the man who held her soul. But then another, much broader figure stepped aggressively into the golden light, Garrick Vance, the sovereign's most trusted general and a brutal warrior lord who valued raw military strength and strategic alliances far above quiet devotion. He held a massive, jewel-encrusted golden goblet in one hand, his scarred face flushed with strong wine and the unchecked arrogance of a recent bloody victory. "So, my king," Garrick boomed, his rough voice echoing harshly off the stone walls of the balcony. "The council is growing extremely restless. They demand to know when you will finally announce a proper, strategic alliance. The High Council's chosen noble bride brings 10,000 trained swords to your banner. She waits for your word." Sophie froze entirely. The warm blood in her veins slowed to a glacial, agonizing crawl. Julian leaned casually against the cold stone balustrade, swirling the dark, blood-red wine in his glass. His face was a flawless mask of bored, aristocratic indifference. He did not look like the exhausted, vulnerable man she had comforted in the library. He looked every inch the cruel, calculating, untouchable sovereign. "The chosen bride is highly demanding," Julian murmured. His voice was a low, rough rumble that usually sent warm shivers of comfort down Sophie's spine. This evening, however, it sounded like grinding, freezing ice. "But her swords are undeniably necessary for the coming winter campaign." "And what of the little shadow?" Garrick asked, taking a deep, sloppy draught of his wine, his tone dripping with blatant disrespect. "The pathetic Omega the guards pulled from the scullery. The council whispers in the dark that she actually carries your fated mark." Sophie stopped breathing entirely. She pressed her scarred hand flat against the freezing cold stone wall to keep her trembling knees from completely collapsing beneath her. Julian laughed. It was not a warm, genuine sound. It was a sharp, biting, entirely dismissive bark of amusement that cut through the crisp night air like a physical, jagged blade. "Sophie?" Julian asked, saying her name as if it were a mild, forgettable annoyance. "She is a biological inconvenience, Garrick, nothing more." The word struck her fragile chest with the devastating force of a steel battering ram. Her fated mark, which only moments ago had been pulsing with warm, hopeful anticipation, suddenly felt like a brand of freezing, jagged iron burning directly into her flesh. But the bond Garrick pushed, though a cruel, knowing smirk played clearly on his scarred lips. "The fated bond is an ancient, outdated joke," Julian replied coldly. He stared out over the dark, snow-covered courtyard, completely and utterly unaware that the woman he was currently destroying stood less than 10 feet away in the shadows, listening to every syllable. "She is a simple, meek, useless little thing, useful for quiet nights when the endless noise of the court gives me a headache, but as a Luna, she has no power, she has no wealth, she has no spine." He took a slow, deliberate sip of his wine, the firelight catching the cruel angle of his jaw. "She will blindly accept whatever meager scraps I throw her. I will keep her hidden away in the lower quarters. She will wait in the kitchens, perfectly content to be a reliable, invisible shadow while I take a politically advantageous bride who can actually rule. She is far too weak to ever leave me." A profound, echoing, absolute silence fell over Sophie's mind. Her inner wolf, which had been humming with absolute, unwavering devotion for 3 long months, let out a single, agonizing, tearing cry of pure, unadulterated grief. Then it went entirely dead. The silence that followed in her subconscious was infinitely louder than the roaring feast hall below. She didn't know the man standing on the balcony had been secretly poisoned by his own ambitious counsel. She didn't know that the dark wine in his goblet was heavily laced with a dark, ancient magic explicitly designed to sever his empathy and amplify his cruelest, most arrogant instincts. She didn't know that his true inner beast was currently screaming, frantically clawing, and trapped beneath a suffocating layer of alchemical manipulation. All she knew was the crushing, absolute, undeniable reality of his spoken words. She is a biological inconvenience. She is far too weak to ever leave, perfectly content to be a reliable, invisible shadow, the sacred thread woven meticulously between their souls, the delicate bond she had nurtured with quiet patience and unconditional, selfless care, violently snapped. It did not break with a loud, dramatic noise. It simply vanished like thin smoke slipping through a crack in the world, leaving behind a cold, massive, hollow cavern in the absolute center of her chest. The physical agony of the severed bond hit her a fraction of a second later. It felt exactly as though someone had reached violently into her ribcage and poured freezing, glacial water directly over her frantically beating heart. She bit down hard on the inside of her cheek. The sharp, hot tang of copper flooded her mouth, grounding her spiraling mind in the harsh physical world. She would not cry. They expected women of low birth to shatter under the weight of royal cruelty. They expected hysterical tears, frantic pleading, and the pitiful, dramatic collapse of an Omega who had foolishly dared to dream above her designated station. But Sophie didn't cry. Her spine, perfectly straight, locked into place with the rigidity of tempered steel. Her striking silver eyes, previously wide with hopeful, soft vulnerability, hardened instantly into unbreakable chips of storm glass. She had spent a brutal lifetime surviving in the unseen shadows of terrible people. She would not allow this man, no matter how terrifyingly powerful his iron crown might be, to turn her quiet survival into a pathetic, laughable joke for his warriors. Her scarred hand, trembling violently against her will, slowly released its desperate grip on the fabric of her pocket. The wrapped linen loosened. The hand-carved wooden wolf slipped from her numb fingers. It fell in agonizingly slow motion. It hit the freezing stone steps of the balcony gallery with a sharp, distinct, hollow clatter. The sound was tiny, completely insignificant against the roaring, chaotic noise of the grand feast raging below, but in the tense, absolute silence of the eastern gallery, it echoed like a deafening gunshot. Julian's head snapped violently toward the tapestry. His storm-grey eyes narrowed sharply, a sudden, frantic flicker of profound confusion breaking through the cold, arrogant mask of his poisoned face. "Who is there?" Garrick barked aggressively, his heavy hand dropping instantly to the leather hilt of his massive broadsword. Sophie did not stay to watch them investigate the shadows. She turned on her heel and walked away. She moved with supernatural, desperate speed, her soft leather shoes making absolutely no sound against the freezing flagstones. She took the first branch left. A serving boy with a towering tray of empty wine cups stared at her open-mouthed as she passed. She did not stop. She took the second branch right, flying past the heavy, judging portraits of dead kings, down 3 steep steps that she had to take in one massive stride to maintain her speed. The freezing, bitter draft of the lower corridors rushed up to meet her, biting viciously at her exposed skin. She was a ghost. A reliable, invisible shadow. He had wanted. A shadow now. He would learn exactly what it meant when the shadow permanently disappeared into the dark. "We are small things in a world of teeth," she thought, her jaw set in an unbreakable iron line, and small things must learn to run before the massive jaws snap shut forever. She did not look back at the grand hall. She did not look back at the intoxicating warmth, the golden, flickering light, or the powerful man who had just shattered her entire world with a single, careless laugh. She walked straight toward her freezing quarters. By 11:30, she had reached the extreme periphery of the keep. The suffocating silence of the forgotten wing swallowed her whole. Sophie knelt on the icy stone floor beside her narrow cot. She pulled a worn canvas satchel from beneath the frame. Her movements were brutally methodical, entirely stripped of emotion. The freezing void in her chest demanded efficiency, leaving no room for hesitation. She packed a single grey wool dress, a sturdy pair of leather boots meant for deep snow, a small iron knife, a flint block. She left the delicate silver comb the serving maids had collectively gifted her. She left the heavy woolen blankets belonging to the keep. She stripped her small life down to its absolute barest bones. At 4 in the morning, the castle finally slept. The booming laughter had dissolved into the pathetic, rumbling snores of drunken lords collapsed in the great hall. Sophie stood before the dying embers of her small grate. From her pocket, she withdrew a rare dried flower, the aronia blossom. She crushed the fragile petals between her fingers and dropped them into the fading orange coals. The flower instantly flared. A thick, bitter herbal scent plumed into the cold air, completely masking her natural fragrance of cedar and pine. It clung to the stone walls, an olfactory erasure of her existence. She pulled her hood over her dark hair and slipped out the door. The eastern gatehouse loomed against the black sky, a jagged silhouette of iron and stone. Marcus Russo stood by the heavy portcullis, a diligent but exhausted guard, working the late-night shift. He rubbed his tired eyes, his breath plumbing in the freezing wind, stamping his heavy boots against the flagstones to keep the circulation flowing. Sophie did not hesitate. She timed her footsteps with the howling gusts of the mountain wind. When Marcus turned his back to warm his numb hands over a low-burning brazier, she slipped through the heavy oak side door, unseen, untraceable, gone. The snow swallowed her tracks the moment her boots hit the tree line. 2 hours later, Julian Sterling woke with a severe, agonizing headache. He dragged himself upright in his massive bed, his skull throbbing violently. The heavy, alchemical fog of the poisoned wine was rapidly receding, leaving behind a jarring, terrifying clarity. Something was deeply, inherently wrong. His chest felt hollowed out, a frantic, primal panic clawed at the inside of his ribs. His inner beast was not just unhinged, it was screaming in absolute, inconsolable terror. The fated bond, usually a steady warm hum in his blood, was entirely dead. Julian threw off the heavy furs, his massive chest heaving. He ignored his royal tunic, stalking out of his chambers wearing only his dark trousers, the freezing stone biting into his bare feet. He practically tore the heavy wooden doors off their hinges as he descended into the lower levels of the keep, his molten gold eyes searching frantically through the gloom. He reached her corridor. He threw her door open, empty, cold, stripped to the bone. The only thing remaining was the stinging, bitter scent of the burned aronia blossom, stinging his lungs and mocking his sudden, desperate panic. No. He turned and sprinted back up the sweeping spiral stairs, his heart pounding a sickening rhythm against his sternum. He reached the eastern gallery, where he had been standing hours before. The early dawn light filtered through the decorative stone slits, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the freezing air. Brandon Cole, his calculating advisor, was already there, speaking in low, serious tones with Garrick. Brandon stopped mid-sentence as the sovereign crashed onto the balcony, looking feral and completely unraveled. Julian ignored them. His eyes locked onto a small object resting on the cold stone steps. He fell to his knees. His large, trembling hands reached out to trace the shattered pieces of ironwood. The wooden wolf lay broken in half. A tiny, dried drop of blood marred the beast's carved neck, a silent testament to the painstaking labor of a woman who had given him everything. "My king?" Garrick asked slowly, his arrogant swagger evaporating instantly at the terrifying sight of the unbroken ruler kneeling in the dust. "The council's chosen bride awaits you." Julian unleashed a roar that shook the very foundations of the northern keep. It was a sound of absolute, devastating ruin. The king had mocked his shadow. Now he was entirely consumed by the dark. 3 months later, safely hidden in a quiet coastal village, the memory of her escape still felt as visceral as a physical blow. On that fateful solstice night, the brutal descent into the forgotten wing of the northern keep had been her final act of submission. Sophie Thorne had walked through the shadowy corridors with the mechanical, deliberate precision of a ghost. The physiological shock of the violently severed fated bond had plunged her entire nervous system into a state of absolute freezing numbness. In her chambers, she had systematically erased her existence. She had pulled her worn, rough-hewn canvas satchel from beneath her bed frame and began the clinical erasure of her presence, packing only a heavy iron hunting knife, a small block of flint, and her warmest woolen cloak. She had burned her meticulous leather-bound diaries, the physical manifestation of her unseen worth. Those pages contained the precise herbal blends that eased the sovereign's headaches and the exact ambient temperatures that calmed his feverish skin. She had destroyed years of quiet, devoted observation that kept Julian Sterling's unhinged beast in check, ensuring that Brandon Cole and Garrick Vance could not weaponize her loyalty to control the monarch. She had watched her unacknowledged sacrifices dissolve into black ash, throwing a single dried aronia blossom into the glowing embers. The fire had hissed violently, aggressively saturating the cold stone walls with a bitter herbal scent to perfectly bury her natural tracking trail. There would be no scent left for the Alpha King to follow. Utilizing her terrifying, supernatural stillness, she had slipped past the sleeping guard, Marcus Russo, at the massive eastern gatehouse. The moment her soft leather boots had hit the untamed, deep snow outside the castle walls, a profound, terrifying sense of finality had crashed over her. She was a runaway, escaping a monarch who had publicly stripped her of her dignity and reduced her profound, unconditional devotion to a laughable weakness. The cold had bitten viciously into her exposed skin, but as she stared into the freezing abyss of the forest, she did not feel fear. She had felt an overwhelming, profound surge of independent clarity. Now, the brutal winter winds of the north were replaced by the rhythmic, steady crash of the ocean. The coastal village was a world away from the rigid, status-driven pack hierarchy of Julian's court. It was a place of salt-stained wood, damp canvas, and the pungent, earthy scent of drying nets and smoking fish. The physical distance between the golden, roaring warmth of the highborn feast and the hazy, salt-thick air of the coast was a perfect reflection of the vast, unbridgeable chasm between her past and her present. Sophie sat at a small, scarred wooden desk near the window of her rented stone cottage, the pale morning light casting a warm, golden hue over the rough parchment in front of her. The biting chill of the Ashenir wilderness was a distant memory here, replaced by the heavy, humid warmth of the sea. She dipped her quill into a small pot of dark ink, the methodical scratch of the nib against the paper offering a soothing, repetitive cadence. She was working as a scribe, translating the raw, spoken dialect of the local fishermen into legible trade ledgers and letters for the mainland merchants. It was humble, quiet work, completely devoid of the high-stakes political maneuvering that the council thrived on. There were no poisoned whispers here, no ambitious courtiers calculating their next move, and no heavy iron crowns to maintain. There was only the honest exchange of copper coins for careful, precise handwriting. The ink was dark and heavy, tracking weeks of peaceful, uninterrupted labor. She spent her mornings writing letters for a weathered ship captain, who needed his cargo manifests translated for the southern ports, and her afternoons drafting simple, heartfelt missives for the young sailors missing their families. The older women of the village respected her silence. They did not pry into her past. They did not ask about the fading, crescent-shaped scar on her collarbone, where her fated mark had once burned with golden heat. They simply accepted her as a quiet anchor in their bustling, chaotic lives, grateful for the young woman who could draft their trade agreements without demanding steep fees or unearned respect. Her body was slowly relearning how to exist without the crushing weight of a sovereign's demands. For months, Sophie had documented every microscopic shift in Julian's erratic moods, acting as a biological shield against his wild inner wolf. The sudden absence of that duty had initially left her feeling entirely unbalanced, as though a vital organ had been surgically removed without anesthesia. The silence of her inner wolf, which had spent 3 months humming with quiet, protective devotion, had been deafening. It had left her body feeling hollowed out, entirely drained by the brutal physical toll of the severed mate bond. But the quiet domestic routine of the village was acting as a slow, deliberate balm on her frayed nervous system. She baked dense, warm loaves of high-country bread in a small stone hearth, letting the comforting scent of yeast and toasted oats fill the small cottage, She drank hot broth seasoned with sea salt, wild thyme, and dried kelp, restoring the strength that the freezing northern keeps had slowly bled from her veins. She slept through the night on a simple, dry mattress filled with sweetgrass, no longer waking in a cold sweat to monitor a cursed king's feverish skin. The physical exhaustion of the severed bond was finally losing its heavy grip on her bones. The massive, hollow cavern of glacial ice inside her chest was beginning to thaw. Her inner wolf, which had gone entirely silent on the night of the grand feast, was slowly beginning to stir. It no longer whimpered for the severed thread of molten gold that had once tethered her soul to Julian's. Instead, it curled around the warm embers of her own independence, content in the safety of their secluded sanctuary. She had spent a lifetime perfecting the art of vanishing into the background. And here, in the hazy, salt-thick air of the coast, she had finally found a place where her invisibility was a choice rather than a punishment. But a fated bond, even a broken one, leaves invisible fault lines in the earth. It is a biological absolute, a sacred thread woven between souls that cannot simply be erased by physical distance or bitter herbal smoke. It was late afternoon when the shift occurred. Sophie was walking back from the bustling village market, carrying a small canvas satchel filled with fresh root vegetables, a heavy iron block of flint, and a bundle of dried lavender. The sky above the turbulent grey ocean was heavily overcast, pregnant with the promise of autumn rain. The coastal gulls, usually shrieking and fighting over scraps of fish near the docks, had gone completely, unnervingly silent. The feral dogs that roamed the alleyways were whimpering, pressing their bellies flat against the damp cobblestones in a display of sudden, involuntary submission. She paused near the edge of the market path, her spine stiffening involuntarily. The ambient temperature around her suddenly dropped, not with the natural, damp chill of the sea breeze, but with a sharp, biting frost that tasted intensely of the northern mountains. It was a vicious, unnatural cold that seeped directly through the thin, grey wool of her dress, raising the fine hairs on her arms. A heavy, unnatural silence fell over the bustling harbour. The loud, aggressive shouts of the dock workers hauling nets seemed to fade, muffled by an oppressive, suffocating pressure that made the air feel incredibly dense. The wooden signs hanging above the tavern doors stopped creaking. The crashing of the waves against the stone seawall sounded strangely distant. Sophie's silver eyes widened slightly, her pulse spiked, a frantic, desperate rhythm hammering against her ribs. The scent hit her a second later, a visceral, overpowering wave of crushed pine needles, burning gold and cold iron. It was a scent that had haunted her every waking moment, a biological imperative that was currently screaming in the terrifying void of her chest, demanding recognition. The air grew heavy with the atmospheric weight of an apex predator. The villagers around her froze, their own latent instincts flaring in sudden, undeniable panic. Mothers pulled their children behind heavy wooden barrels. The hardened sailors reached instinctively for the hunting knives at their belts, though none dared to draw a blade against the terrifying pressure pressing down on the square. Julian Sterling had found her. She did not run. Running created erratic, heavy sounds and signaled prey. She had spent a brutal lifetime surviving the cruelty of powerful people, and she knew that the moment you allowed yourself to physically break, you never truly recovered. Her posture remained perfectly, flawlessly straight. She turned slowly, the heavy grey woolen cloak swirling around her ankles, and faced the entrance to the village square. The Alpha King stepped out of the coastal fog, like a phantom conjured from the darkest depths of a winter nightmare. But the man walking toward her was not the arrogant, impeccably groomed monarch who had laughed at her behind a heavy tapestry in the northern keep. The sovereign of Ashenir was completely unravelled. He wore no iron crown. His dark, formal leathers were torn to shreds, heavily stained with mud, dried blood, and the freezing sleet of 100 different territories. His broad shoulders, usually pulled back in a stance of absolute untouchable authority, were slumped with a crushing, agonizing exhaustion. His storm-grey eyes were wild, deeply sunken into his hollowed face, and entirely consumed by the frantic, unhinged beast that had been violently deprived of its true mate. The physical deterioration was terrifying to witness. Without Sophie's gentle presence to stabilize his curse, the heavy magic of the poisoned wine he had unwittingly consumed had clearly ravaged his biological system, tearing his mind and his wolf apart. He looked like a man who had spent 3 months actively bleeding to death from an invisible wound, sustained only by the desperate, maddening need to find the shadow he had discarded. Every muscle in his body was pulled tight with the agonizing strain of a curse left unchecked. Without her to draw the fever from his skin, the dark magic had consumed his rational mind, leaving only the frantic instinctual need to reclaim his fated mate or die trying. The terrifying, imposing monarch had been reduced to a starving predator, broken by his own arrogance. The villagers backed away, clearing a wide path across the damp cobblestones. Julian did not look at them. He did not issue commands or demand obeisance. His bloodshot, stormy gaze was locked entirely on the quiet woman standing by the market stalls. The moment his gaze found her striking silver eyes, a violent, full-body tremor racked his massive frame. He stopped breathing. He crossed the remaining distance with uneven, heavy strides, the space between them collapsing in seconds. The heavy scent of pine and burning gold threatened to overwhelm her senses, sending a sharp phantom pain echoing through the fading scar on her collarbone. Sophie did not retreat. She clutched her canvas satchel, her knuckles turning white, but she kept her chin lifted. She prepared herself for the aggressive, commanding roar of a king reclaiming his property. She braced for the heavy, suffocating weight of his authority, expecting him to seize her arm and drag her back to the freezing desolation of the keep. Instead, Julian Sterling stopped 3 feet away from her. The imposing monarch, the most powerful and feared wolf in the realm, simply collapsed. He fell to his knees on the damp, uneven stones of the village square, so that his face was lower than hers. The impact sent a dull, heavy thud echoing through the unnervingly quiet harbor. His massive, trembling hands reached out, hovering mere inches from the hem of her grey wool dress. He was desperate to touch her, desperate to ground himself in her warmth, but he was visibly terrified of her rejection. His large hands shook violently, his fingers curling inward as he fought the primal urge to seize her. He did not speak with the voice of a king. When he finally opened his mouth, the sound that tore from his throat was a raw, broken rasp of pure agony, barely audible over the distant roar of the ocean. "I am sorry," he breathed, the words fracturing as they left his dry, cracked lips. "I am so sorry." The arrogant ruler who had mocked his shadow was gone, burned away by the very fire he had started. In his place was a completely hollowed-out shell of a man, begging silently for a single breath of the sanctuary he had so casually destroyed. He had spent months tearing down kingdoms and crossing treacherous ridges, driven to near madness as his pack's luck turned to ash, and his inner wolf violently rejected every political alliance Brandon Cole pushed upon him. He had realized, far too late, that the quiet, unacknowledged labor of a fated mate was the only thing holding his fractured soul together. Sophie looked down at the kneeling sovereign. She saw the heavy, agonizing regret carved into the sharp lines of his beautiful, exhausted face. That agonizing regret had not been born in the salt-thick mist of the coastal harbor, nor had it been forged during the brutal months of crossing freezing mountain ridges. It had taken root on the exact morning the iron gates of Ashenir had slammed shut against the dawn. When Julian Sterling had first opened his eyes, in the heavy gloom of his royal bedchamber, on the morning after the autumn solstice feast, the world had felt fundamentally, biologically wrong. The dark alchemical poisoned wine he had consumed on the private balcony had finally evaporated from his bloodstream, leaving behind a corrosive, burning residue that tasted of cold ash and copper. His skull throbbed with a violent mechanical pressure. It felt as though a blacksmith were hammering tempered steel directly against his temples. For 3 long years, his mornings had begun with a quiet underlying sense of warmth, a subtle humming vibration at the base of his spine that tethered his volatile inner beast to reality. This morning, that anchor was entirely gone. The silence inside his chest was absolute, a dead, frozen void. He sat up slowly. The heavy silver furs slipped away from his broad, scarred shoulders, pooling like liquid moonlight on the mattress. His inner animal, a terrifying apex predator that had ruled the Northern Territories with unyielding cruelty, did not greet the dawn with its customary territorial growl. Instead, the beast lay curled in the darkest corner of his subconscious. It was shivering violently. It was entirely blind and deaf to the pack bond. He reached out with his mind, casting his sovereign awareness across the sweeping stone corridors of the northern keep of Ashenir. He searched desperately for the modest, unassuming signature of the girl who always waited in the periphery. He met only the cold, impenetrable resistance of ancient masonry. She was nowhere in the network. Not a single pulse, not a single breath. He swung his legs over the edge of the mattress, his bare feet hitting the icy floorboards. He did not bother to don his royal tunic or summon his personal attendants. Dressed only in dark trousers, his broad chest exposed to the biting drafts of the keep, Julian walked out into the echoing hallway. The upper gallery still reeked of the previous night's excess. The suffocating scent of roasted meats, spilled wine, and the cloying, expensive perfumes of visiting diplomats hung stagnant in the air. Yet, as he descended the sweeping spiral stairs toward the forgotten eastern wing, that heavy warmth dropped away. The ambient temperature plunged sharply. Spidery patterns of ice clung to the narrow archery slits, whispering of the blizzard raging outside the fortress walls. The shadows grew longer here. The silence grew heavier. He reached the narrow wooden door at the extreme end of the lower corridor. His hand, usually so steady when gripping the hilt of a broadsword, trembled visibly as his fingers closed around the rough iron latch. He pushed the door open. The rusted hinges let out a sharp, protesting scream that shattered the quiet morning. The small chamber was freezing. A sharp, bitter draught blew through the single, narrow window where the glass had been cracked by the winter frost. But it was not the physical cold that caused Julian to stop breathing. It was the absolute, clinical emptiness of the space. The narrow cot against the far wall was stripped down to its bare hemp ropes, the coarse wool blankets folded with military precision and left atop the mattress. The small oak table, where she had spent countless hours sorting dried mountain thyme and brewing his headache remedies, was scrubbed entirely clean. Not a single leaf remained. Not a single drop of spilled tea. The meticulous care of her departure was a devastating blow. He stepped across the threshold, his nostrils flaring as his sensitive olfactory instincts fought to locate her trail. He needed the comforting aroma of cedar, sweet mountain lavender, and fresh pine. He needed the natural scent that had served as his biological shield against the madness of his bloodline. What met his lungs instead was a harsh, stinging wall of bitter herbal smoke. She had burned the aronia blossom in her small hearth before she fled. The pungent, acrid residue of the destroyed flowers clung stubbornly to the soot-stained bricks, a chemical erasure designed specifically to blind a tracking wolf. She had known exactly how his senses worked. She had used his own biological nature against him, ensuring that no scent trail would survive the morning wind. She had vanished like smoke through a crack in the world. Julian crossed the small room in 3 long strides, pressing his palms against the freezing stone windowsill. He looked down into the outer courtyard. Below him, through the swirling white veil of falling snow, the massive iron gates of the eastern gatehouse stood barred and locked against the wilderness. The heavy black portcullis, forged from cold iron to keep out rogue beasts, was lowered deep into the frozen earth. During the festivities, those gates had been guarded by Marcus Russo, yet she had somehow slipped past the watchposts without raising a single alarm or disturbing a single hound. Sophie Thorne possessed an uncanny ability to simply blend into the periphery. For years, he had treated that quiet invisibility as a convenient trait for a servant. He had viewed it as a passive quality that allowed him to conduct his ruthless political campaigns without distraction. Now, staring at the unbroken blankets of snow stretching toward the tree line, He realized her silence had never been weakness. It had been a calculated armor, a shield forged in the fires of constant neglect. A sudden violent spasm racked his chest. He gripped the stone ledge so hard his knuckles turned white, his breath plumbing in rapid, ragged gasps against the frosted glass. The severed, fated bond did not feel like a simple emotional wound. It felt as though an iron blade were being systematically twisted inside his ribcage. Without her quiet presence to continuously absorb the volatile, dark energy of his royal bloodline, his own magic began to turn against him. His skin burned with a sudden, feverish heat, contrasting sharply with the freezing air of the room. His wolf clawed frantically at his skull, letting out a long internal howl of pure, inconsolable grief. She had left him, the woman who had quietly held his fractured soul together. While he mocked her to Garrick Vance had walked out into the winter storm, taking his sanity with her. He turned away from the window. His storm-grey eyes scanned every inch of the barren chamber in desperate search of an oversight, a forgotten scrap of cloth, or a single strand of dark hair. He knelt before the cold hearth. The grey ashes had already settled into a thick, dead powder. He plunged his bare hand directly into the soot, ignoring the bitter sting of the aronia blossom residue. He searched blindly for anything she might have left behind. His fingers scraped against the rough brick floor of the fireplace. There were no remnants of her journals. For months, she had kept meticulous leather-bound ledgers documenting every shift in his temperature, every political dispute that triggered his migraines, and the exact herbal poultices required to soothe his battle wounds. She had burned them all to black soot. She had destroyed the only written record of her unacknowledged value, ensuring that no one in Ashenir would ever again exploit her devotion for their own gain. He pulled his hand back, his skin smeared with dark ash. The physical reality of his isolation settled over his shoulders with the crushing weight of a collapsed mountain. In the grand hall above, the High Council was currently waking from their drunken slumber, eagerly preparing the legal documents for his strategic marriage to the wealthy noble bride. They believed they had successfully removed a minor nuisance from the castle. They believed that by pouring the poisoned wine into their sovereign's cup, filling his veins with dark, empathy-severing magic, they had freed him to act as a ruthless, unattached warlord. They did not understand the biological laws of the moon goddess. A fated mate was not a contract that could be dissolved by court decree or arrogant laughter. It was a sacred thread woven between their souls, stretching, tearing, bleeding. It was a biological absolute. Julian stood up slowly, his tall frame dwarfing the small, freezing room. The emptiness of the chamber pressed against his eardrums, louder than any battle cry he had ever faced on the northern ridges. He had told Garrick Vance that she was a simple, meek little thing who would blindly accept whatever scraps he threw her way. He had boasted that she lacked the spine to ever leave the safety of his kitchens. Now, looking at the stripped hemp mattress and the freezing window, framing the iron gates, the bitter irony of his own words threatened to choke him. She had not begged. She had not wept before his throne, or demanded the recognition she rightfully deserved. She had simply removed her protection, leaving him alone in a fortress of cold stone to face the monstrous reality of his own nature. He was an apex predator trapped in a cage of his own making. Absolutely alone. Julian stumbled out of the freezing quarters, slamming the rough wooden door shut behind him as if trying to seal away a tomb. He could not remain in that empty space. The bitter herbal scent of the burned blossoms was actively tearing at his respiratory tract, while the silence of the room screamed of his betrayal. He moved with erratic, heavy strides back toward the central keep. His bare feet left faint, damp prints on the dusty flagstones. He needed to understand how it had happened. He needed to know the exact timeline of her departure, as if mapping the minutes of her flight could somehow reverse the rotation of the earth and bring her back to his side. He climbed the sweeping stone stairs leading toward the eastern gallery, his breathing ragged and uneven. This was the elevated walkway, where he had stood with his generals during the peak of the celebration, looking down upon the golden brazier of the private balcony. As he reached the top landing, the pale morning light caught the edge of something small and dark, lying abandoned near the stone balustrade. He stopped walking. His pulse dropped to a slow, heavy thrum. There, resting on the freezing masonry, where the shadows of the historical tapestry met the light, lay the wooden wolf. Or rather, a shattered wooden wolf, broken cleanly in two. He fell to his knees on the hard stone. His broad shoulders hunched as he reached out to gather the fractured pieces of the hand-carved wooden wolf. His large, calloused palms, hands that had wielded broadswords and shattered enemy shields without a tremor, shivered violently as he cradled the tiny wooden totem. The craftsmanship was unmistakable. Every microscopic curve of the wolf's alert ears, every tiny incision representing the thick winter fur, had been carved by her small, scarred hands. He remembered finding her in the scullery weeks prior, her fingers stained with dark oil as she painstakingly polished a block of raw timber. She had hidden it beneath her apron when he approached, her silver eyes lowering in quiet modesty. She had spent months laboring over this small figure in the freezing cold of her room, pouring her silent, protective devotion into every stroke of the steel blade. He pressed the broken halves of the hand-carved wooden wolf against his face, closing his eyes as he inhaled deeply. Here, protected within the dense grain of the ironwood where the aronia blossom smoke had not penetrated, lingered the pure, unadulterated scent of his fated mate, sweet mountain lavender, freshly chopped cedar, the clean, earthy aroma of rain on stone. The scent hit his brain like a physical shockwave, instantly clearing the remaining fog of the alchemical poisoned wine from his mind. The horror of the truth crashed down upon him with devastating clarity. She had been here. She had walked up these very steps while the feast raged below, carrying this small protective totem in her pocket to present to him as a token of her eternal bond. She had stood hidden behind the heavy velvet tapestry, holding her breath in the dark, waiting for the right moment to step into the golden light of the balcony, and instead of receiving her gift, she had stood in the shadows and listened as he casually destroyed her world. He remembered his exact words to Garrick Vance. She is a biological inconvenience. She has no power. She has no wealth. She has no spine. His wolf let out a guttural, tearing whimper inside his chest. She had heard every single syllable. She had stood less than 10 feet away, her heart beating with hopeful devotion, while he mocked her low birth and laughed at the sacred thread woven between their souls. She had not dropped the carving by accident. Her numb fingers had simply released it when her spirit broke. Then, with a dignity that defied every expectation of his arrogant court, she had turned her back on Julian and walked away into the freezing night. Not used, not owned, chosen, and she had chosen to leave. Julian, a smooth, carefully measured voice called out from the archway of the gallery. Julian did not look up immediately. His fingers tightened around the broken pieces of the wooden wolf. The sharp, splintered edges of the ironwood bit deep into the flesh of his palm until warm blood welled to the surface. He slowly turned his head. Standing at the entrance of the stone walkway was Brandon Cole, the faint, cloying scent of poisoned honey trailing behind his fine garments. The royal advisor was dressed in immaculate, dark velvet, not a single thread out of place, his silver-headed walking stick resting lightly against the flagstones. Brandon's face wore a practiced expression of polite concern, but his dark eyes gleamed with the cold, calculating satisfaction of a courtier whose long-term strategy had finally borne fruit. "The High Council has convened in the Chamber of Records," Brandon said, stepping forward onto the gallery, his polished leather shoes making a sharp, rhythmic clicking sound against the cold stone. "Garrick Vance has already received the formal missive from the Southern envoys. The noble bride's dowry of 10,000 trained swords is ready to march the moment you sign the betrothal contract. It is a glorious morning for Ashenir." Julian remained kneeling on the floor, the blood from his palm dripping slowly onto the shattered wood. "She is gone, Brandon," he said. His voice was not the booming, authoritative command of a warlord. It was a low, dangerous rasp that vibrated with the raw, unstable pressure of a collapsing storm. Brandon stopped 2 paces away, offering a slight, dismissive wave of his gloved hand. The scent of poisoned honey thickened in the freezing air, sickly and manipulative. "The scullery maid?" Yes. Marcus Russo reported that a small figure slipped through the eastern gate during the early morning watch, a minor breach of protocol, easily overlooked. In truth, Julian, her voluntary departure saves the Council a tremendous amount of administrative embarrassment. A woman of such low birth would have only served as a permanent stain on your royal lineage. With her out of the keep, your political transition will be entirely seamless. "Seamless," Julian repeated, the word tasting like poison on his tongue. "Indeed," Brandon continued, entirely oblivious to the lethal temperature drop occurring within the gallery. "However, there is a minor, dire situation developing on the training grounds that requires your immediate sovereign authority. It appears the girl's sudden departure has triggered an unexpected biological resonance among the inner pack." Julian slowly rose to his feet. His massive frame towered over the advisor, his broad chest rising and falling with ragged heavy breaths. "Speak." Brandon's polite smile faltered slightly as he stepped back from the radiating heat of the monarch's skin. Within an hour of sunrise, the latent beast curses carried by the royal bloodline began to destabilize across the barracks. 3 of our elite border sentries suffered spontaneous, violent shifts during their morning drills. They attacked their own commanders. Their inner wolves have gone entirely unhinged, refusing to recognize pack hierarchy or verbal commands. The warding totems surrounding the outer armory have fractured from the sheer atmospheric pressure of their rage. Brandon cleared his throat, adjusting the collar of his velvet tunic with a sudden nervous twitch. "The healers have examined the men. They claim that the biological stability of the entire Northern Territory was tethered directly to her presence within the keep. Without her quiet aura to continuously cleanse the dark energy of our bloodline, the pack's inner beast is shattering. They are turning feral, Julian. The men are losing their minds." A profound, terrifying clarity washed over Julian Sterling. He looked at Brandon Cole. He looked at the immaculate clothes, the calculating eyes, the suffocating aroma of poisoned honey, and the smug certainty of a man who believed magic and bloodlines could be manipulated like pieces on a chessboard. They had used the poisoned wine to strip away his empathy. They had mocked his mate to drive her into the freezing snow. They had believed that removing the quiet, unassuming Omega would make their king a stronger, more ruthless weapon for their wars. Instead, they had broken the only seal holding back the apocalypse. "You thought her useless," Julian whispered, his grey irises beginning to bleed into a brilliant, terrifying molten gold. "You thought, because she walked with a quiet step and scrubbed your ash from the hearths, that she possessed no power. Julian, we simply prioritized the survival of the realm." Brandon stammered, taking another hurried step backward as the ambient air in the gallery began to crackle with violent, visible arcs of static electricity. "She was the realm," Julian roared, the sound shattering the decorative glass panes of the gallery windows. The wind rushed in, howling around them like a chorus of damned souls. Every breath of peace this cursed pack enjoyed for 3 years was purchased by her silence. Every fever that spared our warriors was drawn into her own body. She held the beast of Ashenir by the throat with her bare hands, and you drove her into the dark. He raised his bleeding fist, opening his fingers to reveal the broken pieces of the hand-carved wooden wolf resting in his palm. The ironwood was stained crimson with his royal blood. "There will be no betrothal contract," Julian stated, his voice dropping into a cold, absolute register that made the advisor fall to his knees in involuntary biological submission. "There will be no Southern Alliance. You will tell the High Council that if they speak the name of the noble bride again, I will feed them to the feral sentries in the courtyard." And what of the campaign?" Brandon gasped, trembling violently against the stone floor, his walking stick clattering away from his grasp. What of the winter wars? Let the winter burn, Julian said. He turned his back on the cowering advisor and looked out through the shattered glass toward the endless, snow-covered wilderness of the east. His inner wolf, no longer paralyzed by the poison, rose up inside his chest with a terrifying, obsessive single-mindedness. The weak are but fragile morsels waiting to be devoured by predators, he thought, remembering the quiet courage of the woman who had walked away without a single tear. But he was not a small thing. He was a monster who had lost his soul, and he would tear the world apart until he found where she had hidden it. "Summon the guard," Julian commanded to the empty wind. "We hunt." The hunt did not begin with the measured, strategic precision of a sovereign's military campaign. It began as a feral, unhinged tear through the frozen northern ridges, driven by a blinding biological panic that tore the very fabric of the kingdom apart. The months that followed dragged with the crushing, agonizing weight of centuries. To the human mind, 90 days was a mere transition of a single season, a slow shift from the bitter autumn solstice into the deep, suffocating grip of a high-country winter. But to the primal, unhinged beast residing within Julian Sterling's ribs, every rising sun that failed to carry the delicate scent of cedar and sweet mountain lavender was an eternity of solitary confinement. He had commanded the guard to search, but he did not wait in the comfort of his throne room for their reports. Julian rode at the absolute front of the tracking party, a terrifying phantom of a monarch tearing blindly through the harshest wilderness the realm had to offer. The harsh, blinding white of the Ashenir winter gave no quarter. Julian pushed his massive, dark destrier through treacherous snowdrifts that reached the beast's powerful chest, the freezing winds howling down from the mountain peaks to bite viciously at any exposed flesh. Yet the sovereign wore no heavy silver furs. His broad, scarred torso was clad only in standard, weathered leather armor, leaving his muscular arms entirely exposed to the sub-zero temperatures. He did not feel the cold. The poisoned wine slipped to him by the council had unlocked and weaponized the latent heat of his ancestral curse. Without the quiet, grounding presence of his fated mate to absorb and neutralize the dark magic, his blood had turned into a boiling, corrosive venom. His skin radiated a terrifying, feverish heat that actively melted the falling snowflakes before they could even touch his shoulders. He was burning alive from the inside out, consumed by the sheer atmospheric pressure of a severed soul. The biological absolute of the fated mate bond was not a mere romantic ideal whispered by the court poets. It was the structural, magical foundation of the entire territory. Without the true Luna to anchor the massive, volatile energy of Julian Sterling, the physical realm of Ashenir actively began to rot. The decay was not subtle. It was a visceral, horrifying collapse of natural order. The deep forest springs, which usually flowed with crisp, magical clarity even in the dead of winter, froze solid into black, impenetrable ice. The warding totems forged of cold iron that lined the eastern borders began to develop deep, jagged fissures, entirely shattering under the unchecked ambient pressure of the pack's destabilized magic. The high country bread baked in the village, hearths turned to grey, tasteless ash before it could properly rise. The land itself was mourning the loss of the quiet shadow who had paid for its peace with her own invisible labour. Garrick Vance rode 3 paces behind his sovereign, his massive broadsword feeling utterly, pathetically useless against his hip. The brutal warrior lord who had confidently laughed on the golden balcony, who had aggressively valued a dowry of 10,000 southern swords over the quiet devotion of a scullery maid, was now witnessing the catastrophic collapse of his own ruthless philosophy. Swords could not fight a biological curse. Armies could not reverse the rapid, terrifying deterioration of their sovereign's mind. The elite border sentries were falling apart rapidly. Just 3 nights prior, in a temporary tracking camp pitched near the desolate Thornwick Valley, the unthinkable had occurred. 2 of Garrick's most disciplined, hardened lieutenants had suffered spontaneous, violent shifts during the midnight watch. They had turned entirely feral, their inner wolves, driven mad by the severed pack network and the suffocating absence of the Luna's soothing aura, had refused all verbal commands. They had torn through the heavy canvas tents in a blind, unhinged panic, their jaws snapping at their own comrades, until Julian had physically thrown himself into the fray. The monarch had pinned the massive beasts to the frozen earth with his bare hands, his storm-grey eyes bleeding into a violently unstable molten gold, holding them down until the sheer, terrifying weight of his sovereign dominance forced them back into human form. But dominance was not a cure. It was merely a tourniquet applied to a severed artery. Julian had not slept since the exact morning he found the empty quarters and the lingering, bitter scent of the burned aronia blossom. Sleep required lowering his biological defenses, and whenever he closed his heavy, bloodshot eyes, the violently severed bond sent a phantom, burning agony tearing directly through the scar on his collarbone. It felt exactly as though a jagged iron hook was lodged securely in his chest, pulling tighter with every mile that separated them. Instead of resting, he kept his right hand pressed firmly against his sternum. Hidden securely beneath the rough leather ties of his armor, pressed directly against his bare, feverish skin were the two splintered fragments of the ruined figurine. The jagged, splintered edges of the fractured ironwood dug viciously into his flesh with every movement of his horse. He welcomed the sharp bite of the wood. It was a grounding, visceral pain that cut through the alchemical fog of his deteriorating mind. It was the only tangible, physical proof that her quiet, unwavering devotion had not simply been a hallucination conjured by a lonely monster. They tracked false leads across 3 neighboring kingdoms. They tore through secluded mountain villages, deep forest logging camps, and freezing trade outposts. Julian, the terrifying monarch who possessed a magical lineage older than the mountains themselves, was reduced to a frantic, starving predator digging through the snow. He kicked down the heavy oak doors of roadside taverns, his massive frame blocking the exits, while his eyes desperately scanned the terrified, huddled crowds for a single glimpse of a simple grey wool dress or a pair of striking silver eyes. He inhaled the stale, smoky air of 100 different hearths, frantically searching for the specific, delicate aroma of cedar and pine. Nothing. She had utilized her natural talent for being unseen with devastating perfection. My lord, Garrick had rasped during a brutal, blinding sleet storm along the western ridge, his arrogant swagger completely erased by weeks of relentless, freezing misery. The general's scarred face was pale, his lips blue from the cold. The hounds have lost the trail completely. The snow has buried everything. The men are freezing to death in the saddles. Their beasts are whimpering in the dark. We must return to the keep and regroup. Julian had not even turned his head to acknowledge his most trusted commander. He simply stared forward into the blinding white void of the blizzard, his jaw locked in a rigid line of absolute, unyielding refusal. "Then the men can freeze," Julian whispered. His voice was a low, terrifying rumble that vibrated powerfully over the howling wind, entirely devoid of the regal polish he had once worn in the feast hall. "We do not turn back. We do not rest. We hunt until my heart stops beating in my chest, Garrick, because without her there is no keep to return to. The borderland trails were where you went to be forgotten." But Julian Sterling was learning the agonizing truth of the old kingdom legends. A name unspoken for 5 years might grow teeth, but a mate discarded in the dark grew into a phantom that actively strangled the breath from your lungs. By the end of the 3rd month, the tracking party had descended from the freezing northern altitudes into the heavy, drenched valleys of the southern coast. The bitter blizzards of Ashenir had been replaced by a relentless, punishing coastal rain that turned the earth into a deep, sucking mire of freezing mud. The command tent was pitched precariously on a muddy ridge, overlooking the churning, violent grey waters of the southern strait. The relentless rain battered the heavy canvas roof, creating a deafening, rhythmic drumming that completely drowned out the restless, anxious whimpering of the tethered horses outside. Inside the tent, the ambient temperature was suffocatingly hot. The heat did not come from the small iron brazier sputtering weakly in the corner. It radiated directly from Julian's fever-ravaged body. The air was incredibly dense, thick with the scent of wet leather, old blood, and the terrifying, crackling ozone of a sovereign's entirely unrestrained emotional agony. Julian stood hunched over a massive, unrolled map of the continent, his scarred palms braced heavily against the splintering edge of a rough oak table. His steely gaze tracked the chaotic, desperate web of red ink that marred the sprawling parchment. Every line represented a failed search trajectory. Every circled village represented a dead end. He was staring blindly at the coastlines, the physical exhaustion finally beginning to blur his vision when the heavy tent flap was violently thrown open. A vicious gust of freezing wind and horizontal rain rushed into the suffocating space. Brandon Cole stepped inside. The once immaculate, calculating royal advisor looked completely ruined. His expensive, tailored dark velvet tunic was heavy with mud, sea salt, and freezing water, clinging pathetically to his thin, shivering frame. The faint, cloying scent of poisoned honey that always trailed the courtier was entirely overpowered by the raw, visceral stench of his own biological fear. Brandon did not carry his elegant silver-headed walking stick. He was trembling violently, his shoulders hunched, entirely subdued by the immense atmospheric weight of Julian's feral, unpredictable presence. Julian slowly lifted his head from the map. His face was a hollowed-out mask of sharp, dangerous angles. Deep, bruised shadows of profound sleep deprivation circled his sunken eyes. When he looked at the advisor, his gaze was not human. It was the empty, predatory stare of a starving beast, determining whether the trembling prey standing before it was worth the physical effort of the kill. "I have a report," Brandon rasped, his voice cracking painfully as he forced himself to step closer to the radiating, dangerous heat of the monarch. The advisor did not offer brilliant military strategies. He did not speak of the wealthy noble bride from the south whose 10,000 swords had been abruptly, aggressively dismissed without a second thought on the morning of the solstice. He did not speak of council decrees or political alliances. Instead, his shaking, mud-stained hands offered a simple folded piece of coarse yellow parchment from within his saturated cloak. Julian did not immediately take the paper. He stared at it, a low, dangerous growl vibrating deep within the cavern of his chest. If this is another false sighting from a desperate merchant seeking royal coin to pay his debts, Julian murmured, his voice as rough and grating as heavy iron dragging across river stones, "I will have you permanently stripped of your title, Brandon. I will chain you to the outer wall and let the winter freeze the lies from your throat." "It is not a sighting, my lord." Brandon swallowed hard, his dark eyes dropping instantly to the muddy floorboards in a profound, involuntary display of absolute biological submission. "It is a trade ledger, a simple, mundane translation of a cargo manifest retrieved from a small, deeply isolated coastal settlement 300 miles to the south. The local fishermen recently hired a new scribe to handle their mainland shipments. A quiet, unassuming woman in grey wool who keeps entirely to herself. She requires no royal coin, Julian. She asks only for dry shelter and silence." Julian's massive, scarred hand shot forward, snatching the yellow parchment directly from the advisor's trembling grasp. The paper was slightly damp from the coastal rain. When he brought it closer to his face, his highly sensitive olfactory receptors caught the faint, lingering scent clinging to the fibers. It smelled of dried kelp, bitter sea salt, and cheap dark ink. But beneath the overwhelming odor of the ocean, buried deep within the grain of the parchment, was the faintest impossible ghost of cedar. He carried the ledger closer to the flickering, golden light of the iron brazier. His breath caught violently in his throat, a sharp, ragged gasp that sounded like tearing silk. The handwriting hit him with the devastating, undeniable force of a physical blow. He would know the precise, meticulous curves of that script if he were completely blind. He had spent months watching her sit quietly in the dim, flickering light of his royal library, carefully recording his volatile political disputes, and mapping out his herbal headache remedies in her leather-bound diaries. He knew the sharp, exact angles of the vowels. He recognized the heavy strokes of the consonants, pressed firmly into the paper by small, scarred hands that intimately knew the grueling weight of invisible domestic labor. It was not the flourishing, decorative, empty calligraphy of a high-born noble trained in the courts. It was the functional, resilient, survivalist script of a woman who had spent a brutal lifetime learning exactly how to endure in a world of teeth. The massive, freezing void in Julian's chest suddenly contracted. The violent, corrosive heat of the dark magic racing through his veins hit a massive, invisible wall. For the first time in 3 agonizing months, his wild inner wolf stopped its frantic, destructive pacing. The beast went entirely still, its alert ears snapping forward in the dark of his subconscious, recognizing the absolute undeniable physical proof of its mate's continued existence. She was alive, while his entire kingdom actively rotted from the inside out, and his elite warriors lost their minds to the feral curse of their bloodline. The woman he had carelessly mocked behind a heavy tapestry was quietly surviving. She was rebuilding her independent life by the freezing sea, utilizing her unrecognized intellect to write humble cargo manifests for rough, unpolished sailors. She had walked away from the wealth of Ashenir without a single tear, and she had proven that she did not need his iron crown. She did not need his protection. Julian's large hands shook violently, while he gently traced the dark ink of her handwriting, terrified that pressing too hard might cause the fragile illusion to shatter into dust. He dropped the yellow parchment gently onto the rough oak table, right on top of the useless, chaotic map. He did not issue a formal royal command. He did not summon Garrick Vance, and he did not order the guard to form defensive ranks for a march. The time for massive military processions and arrogant displays of sovereign power was entirely over. Julian reached up and unbuckled the heavy iron clasps of his armor. He stripped the hardened leather from his broad shoulders, letting the priceless, protective gear crash carelessly onto the muddy floorboards of the tent. He required no physical armor. He required no royal entourage to shield him. He was a man who had burned down his own sanctuary, and he would walk into the freezing rain entirely exposed. He reached inside his tunic, his large hand wrapping securely around the 2 remnants of the broken totem, resting flush against his feverish skin. The splintered ironwood bit deep into his palm, a grounding, painful reminder of the massive emotional debt he owed. "My lord?" Brandon asked, his voice a pathetic squeak as he shrank back against the damp canvas wall, watching the monarch stalk rapidly toward the exit. "Shall I assemble the elite escort? The coastal roads are treacherous." Julian did not look back. He tore the heavy tent flap open with a single violent pull, stepping out directly into the freezing, relentless coastal storm. The heavy rain instantly soaked his dark hair, plastering it against his hollowed face, but the violent, feral urgency surging back into his blood made him completely impervious to the biting cold. No woman ever survived him. The kingdom of Ashenir had whispered for generations a dark, protective legend warning of the volatile curse that burned anyone who dared to touch the sovereign. But when the Alpha King shifted his massive body into the heavy, concealing shadows of the coastal rain, his tempestuous gaze bleeding completely and permanently into a blinding, desperate molten gold, he finally understood the absolute, devastating truth. He was the one who could not survive without her. Julian Sterling vanished into the driving storm, moving with the terrifying supernatural speed of an apex predator that had finally caught the scent of its own severed soul, desperate to cross the remaining miles. He rode relentlessly through the night and into the bleak grey dawn. The heavy destrier eventually collapsed from sheer exhaustion 2 miles outside the coastal settlement. Julian did not pause. He abandoned the beast to rest and continued on foot. The coastal winds lashed at his unprotected skin, tearing at the dark linen of his undertunic, but the active poison burning in his veins made him oblivious to the freezing rain. All he felt was the agonizing, phantom pull of the severed bond, a massive iron hook dragging him toward the sea. The coastal village was a poor, isolated cluster of weathered timber and grey stone clinging precariously to the cliffs. When Julian descended the final rocky ridge, the storm began to break, pale shafts of morning light piercing the heavy clouds to illuminate the muddy village square. The salty air was thick with the smell of drying nets, rotting wood, and the bitter brine of the Southern Ocean. But beneath it all, clear and undeniable, was the faint, impossible scent of cedar and sweet mountain lavender. He stumbled into the square. His dark hair was plastered to his hollowed cheeks, his boots heavy with mud and blood from the grueling journey. He looked nothing like a sovereign. He looked like a shattered, feral beast at the very end of its endurance. The few villagers who were awake froze in their tracks. The sheer, terrifying atmospheric pressure radiating from the towering, scarred man sent them backing away in absolute silence. They recognized a predator when they saw one. Julian did not look at them. His slate-colored irises, glowing with a desperate molten gold, were locked on the small open-fronted merchant stall at the far end of the square. She was there. Sophie Thorne sat quietly at a rough wooden table, meticulously copying numbers onto a large parchment ledger. She wore a simple, unadorned grey wool dress. Her dark hair was braided loosely over one shoulder. There was no royal silk, no silver embroidery, no elaborate court finery, just the quiet, observant woman who had once stood hidden behind a heavy tapestry and listened to him mock her very existence. Julian's heart slammed against his ribs with a violent, concussive force. The boiling, corrosive venom in his veins instantly receded, neutralized by the mere sight of her. The agonizing, jagged pain in his chest evaporated, replaced by a profound, overwhelming sensory relief that nearly sent him to the ground. He took a ragged, shuddering breath, the sound impossibly loud in the quiet square. Sophie's pen stopped. She did not jump. She did not gasp in terror. Carefully, with the methodical calm of a woman who had spent months rebuilding her entire world from scratch, she lifted her head. Her striking silver eyes met his glowing gold ones. The physical space between them crackled with the intense, unresolved energy of their fated bond, stretching, tearing, bleeding. But Sophie's expression was entirely unreadable. She did not cry. She did not scream. She simply looked at him, her posture straight, her chin lifted in quiet dignity. She possessed a natural ability to remain entirely unseen, but now, bathed in the pale morning light, she was the only thing Julian could see. He took a step forward. His massive frame trembled violently, entirely stripped of the arrogant, status-driven pride that had defined his rule at the northern keep of Ashenir. He had commanded armies. He had dismissed the daughters of rival lords, but he had fundamentally misunderstood where true power lay. Julian crossed the muddy square, every step heavy, agonizing, slow. The villagers watched in stunned silence as the terrifying monarch approached the quiet scribe. When he reached the edge of her wooden stall, he did not speak. He did not issue a command. The sovereign of Ashenir, a man whose wild inner wolf had driven his kingdom to the brink of collapse, simply fell. Julian dropped directly to his knees in the freezing, sucking mud of the village square. The impact sent a splatter of dark filth across the hem of his own trousers, but he did not care. His broad shoulders slumped forward, entirely subdued. He reached out with shaking, scarred hands, stopping inches from the rough hem of her grey wool dress, terrified that touching her might cause the fragile illusion to break. He bowed his head, his dark hair falling forward to hide the wet, raw emotion tearing through his turbulent gaze, a physical testament to the horrific toll the ancestral curse had taken on his humanity. Slowly, with agonizing vulnerability, he opened his right hand, resting in his muddy, bleeding palm were the sundered pieces of the wooden carving she had painstakingly crafted for him on the night of the autumn festival. The edges were stained with his own blood, proof of how fiercely he had held on to her memory through the freezing wilderness. The silence stretched, thick and suffocating. The entire village held its breath. Julian stared at the shattered wood, his chest heaving, as the words he had suppressed for 3 months finally clawed their way out of his throat. His voice, when it broke the stillness, was not the voice of a monarch. It was a raw, broken rasp of absolute, unconditional surrender. "I am a monster who lost his soul," Julian whispered to the mud, refusing to meet her eyes because he knew he did not deserve to. "And I have torn the world apart, trying to find where you hid it. Please, Sophie, let me atone." Sophie looked down at the broken man kneeling before her in the dirt. The cold coastal wind shifted the delicate, ghostly scent of aronia blossom and cedar between them, a brutal reminder of the night she had erased her presence from his keep. The villagers continued to watch in breathless silence as the most feared ruler in the realm submitted entirely to their unassuming scribe. She kept her straight spine, her expression guarded, the absolute picture of survivalist stoicism. She did not immediately answer. Instead, she let the silence stretch out, heavy and absolute, forcing him to sit in the suffocating weight of the consequences he had wrought. Then, gracefully, the woman in grey wool lowered herself to the muddy ground. She did not kneel to a sovereign. She knelt to meet a broken, cursed man exactly where he was. The freezing mud stained her simple dress, but she did not care. With quiet intention, she reached out her scarred, ink-stained hands, gently cradled his massive, bleeding palms. Julian let out a ragged, shattering breath as her cool skin made contact with his. The physical burning of the weaponized curse instantly snuffed out, replaced by a profound, golden warmth that rushed through his veins like dawn breaking over a frozen lake. The agonizing pressure in his chest dissolved into absolute relief. "Atonement is not a decree you can shout from a throne, Julian," Sophie said, her voice quiet, but carrying an unshakable, ancient strength. "It is a choice made every single day, in the dark, without an audience." She carefully took the fractured remnants of the ironwood totem from his trembling grasp, holding them together in her palms. "I will not return to the tapestry shadows," she whispered, her silver eyes locking onto his molten gold ones, demanding absolute truth. "And I will not be a secret you hide from the cold." Julian lifted his head, tears scuttling tracks through the grime on his hollowed cheeks. He did not care who saw his vulnerability. He leaned forward, resting his forehead gently against hers, entirely surrendering the weight of his crown. "Never." Julian rumbled against her skin, his eyes closing as the first true wave of peace in months settled over his feral soul. "You are my Luna, my sanctuary. My only light in the dark. Let me stay by this hearth until I earn the right to stand beside you." Sophie did not smile, but the rigid line of her shoulders finally relaxed. She closed her eyes and let her breath mingle with his, accepting the warmth of his proximity. The silent departure had broken them both. But here, in the humble coastal mud, the agonizing work of true healing had finally begun. Thank you for listening to this story of betrayal, quiet survival, and redemption. If you felt the warmth of this sanctuary, please take 2 seconds to like, leave a comment with your favorite scene, and subscribe for more tales of quiet triumphs. The coastal dawn broke not with the blinding, pristine white of the Ashenir snow, but with a heavy, bruised, grey light that bled slowly across the turbulent southern ocean. Julian Sterling opened his eyes. For the first time in 3 agonizing months, the boiling, corrosive venom of the poisoned wine did not instantly sear the fragile lining of his veins. The violent, alchemical fever that had driven his inner beast to the brink of absolute madness had been drawn from his blood, absorbed and neutralized by the quiet, unassuming touch of the woman he had once mocked in the shadows. He was lying on a narrow, rough-hewn cot inside a small, salt-stained fisherman's hut. The air in the room was incredibly dense, thick with the pungent, earthy aroma of drying kelp, old fishing nets, and the bitter brine of the endless sea. It was a humble, dilapidated sanctuary. Yet, as the sovereign of the Northern Territories slowly pushed himself up from the coarse woolen blankets, the silence inside his chest was a profound, overwhelming relief. He remembered the previous evening in fractured, delirious fragments that slowly coalesced into a solid, undeniable truth. He remembered the grueling, desperate march into the village square. He remembered collapsing into the freezing mud, his massive frame completely unraveled by the toxic magic and the crushing weight of his own profound regret. He remembered her small, ink-stained hands, gently cradling his bleeding palms. The searing pain had evaporated the moment her cool skin made contact with his, pulling him back from the precipice of feral insanity. He had whispered his desperate apology to the dirt. He had asked to stay by her hearth, and then he remembered the rigid line of her shoulders, finally relaxing as they sat by the fire, her quiet breath mingling with his in the dark. The agonizing work of true healing had begun in that fragile, silent space. He sat on the edge of the narrow cot, his broad, scarred shoulders hunched in the dim morning light. The physical pain was entirely gone, but the biological reality of the fated bond remained a quiet, tentative ember. The sacred thread of molten gold that had once connected their souls was no longer dead, but it was dormant, waiting to see if the ashes could truly sustain a spark. Her touch in the mud had cured his poisoned body, and her presence by the hearth had stabilized his beast, but the bridge between them was still made of glass. He looked down at his trembling hands. He was entirely stripped of his terrifying authority. He wore no iron crown. His dark, formal leathers were ruined, stiff with dried mud, coastal dirt, and sea salt. He was completely alone. Garrick Vance and the elite tracking guard were miles away, left behind in the chaotic wake of his blind, unhinged sprint toward the coast. Brandon Cole was entirely absent, his suffocating scent of poisoned honey replaced by the honest, harsh reality of the freezing ocean wind. Even Marcus Russo, the diligent Eastern Gatehouse guard, who had been the last to unwittingly see her on the night of the autumn solstice feast, felt like a memory from a different lifetime. Julian was just a man, a broken, penitent man who had burned down his own world and was now desperately hoping to crawl through the ashes to rebuild it. Julian stood up, his heavy boots echoing softly against the uneven wooden floorboards. Resting on a small, scarred oak table near the door was a stack of rough yellow parchment. He reached out, his fingers brushing the top page. It was a translated cargo manifest, detailing the shipment of winter cod and woven ropes for the mainland merchants. The handwriting was unmistakable. The precise, meticulous curves of Sophie Thorne's survivalist script hit his chest like a physical blow. It was undeniable proof of her independent existence. She had not perished in the freezing snow. She had not wept in the dark after overhearing his cruel mockery. She had simply moved on, utilizing her unrecognized intellect to build a quiet, secure life far away from the rigid, status-driven hierarchy of his court. He stepped out of the fisherman's hut and into the biting coastal wind. The village was already fiercely alive. The bustling town operated on a chaotic, rhythmic cadence that was entirely alien to the cold, structured silence of the northern keep. Weathered sailors shouted over the crashing waves, hauling massive wooden crates of raw oysters onto the docks. Elderly women sat on overturned barrels, their calloused hands rapidly mending heavy hemp nets. It was a world of raw, unfiltered survival, completely devoid of the treacherous political maneuvering that Julian had spent his entire life mastering. He closed his storm-grey eyes, letting his highly sensitive olfactory receptors sweep through the heavy, humid air. Beneath the overpowering stench of rotting fish and wet canvas, he found it, the delicate, impossible ghost of cedar and sweet mountain lavender. His inner wolf whimpered softly in the dark cavern of his subconscious, its alert ears snapping forward. The beast dropped its heavy snout toward the damp earth, adopting a posture of absolute, unconditional submission as it tracked the scent of its lost Luna. Julian opened his eyes and followed the invisible trail, his massive frame navigating through the narrow, muddy alleyways of the town. The path led him away from the wooden docks and down toward the expansive, sweeping shoreline. The tide was out, leaving behind a massive, flat expanse of wet sand that perfectly reflected the bruised, overcast sky like a shattered mirror. The freezing ocean spray lashed against his face, but Julian did not feel the cold. His entire existence was suddenly narrowed down to a single breathtaking focal point in the distance. Sophie Thorne. She was standing knee-deep in the freezing surf, surrounded by a group of laughing, weathered village women. They were working together to drag a heavy, overflowing fishing net onto the wet sand. Sophie was not wearing the drab, modest grey wool of a terrified scullery maid. She wore a practical salt-stained canvas dress, the hem tied up around her thighs to keep it out of the water. Her dark hair was loose, whipping wildly in the aggressive coastal wind. Her skin, once pale and drawn from the oppressive shadows of the keep, was flushed with the vibrant, undeniable heat of genuine physical exertion. And she was smiling. It was not a polite, guarded expression. It was a radiant, breathless, entirely unguarded laugh that reached her striking silver eyes. The sound drifted over the crashing waves, hitting Julian with the devastating force of a steel battering ram. He had spent months sharing a castle with this woman. He had watched her scrub his hearths, brew his teas, and stand quietly in the periphery of his grand feasts. Not once, in all those hundreds of days, had she ever smiled like that. He had kept her in a cage of absolute, freezing isolation, convinced that his protection was a gift. Now, watching her move with natural, joyous freedom on the vast expanse of the coast, the crushing magnitude of his arrogance finally broke him. He moved a slow, heavy step onto the beach. His heavy boots sank deep into the abrasive wet sand, a physical manifestation of his rapidly sinking heart. The shoreline offered no solid footing, no unyielding stone foundations like the ones he had proudly stood upon when he mocked her. Here, the ground shifted and collapsed beneath his weight. Julian continued forward. The sheer atmospheric pressure of his sovereign presence inevitably bled into the surrounding air, despite his desperate attempts to restrain his wild beast. The laughing village women instantly felt the shift in the environment, their latent instincts flaring in sudden, undeniable panic as they recognized the approach of an apex predator. They backed away, huddling together near the dunes, leaving Sophie standing entirely alone on the wet sand. Sophie did not back away. She did not flinch. She slowly wiped her wet, calloused hands on her canvas apron and turned to face him. The wind caught the loose strands of her dark hair, framing a face that was flawlessly composed. Julian closed the remaining distance, his heart hammering a frantic, desperate rhythm against his ribs. Her silver eyes, once wide with hopeful, soft vulnerability in the corridors of Ashenir, were now carefully guarded. The impenetrable ice that had shielded her for 3 months had begun to thaw by the hearth last night, leaving behind a weary, cautious softness. She was not a vacant wall of emotion. She was simply waiting. The gentle woman who had meticulously carved a protective totem for him was still there, but she was now protected by the hardened survivor who had learned to value her own peace. "You are awake," Sophie said. Her voice was calm, anchored by the quiet understanding they had reached in the dark hours of the morning. There was no fury in her tone, nor was there the empty indifference he had feared. Instead, there was a steady, resolute boundary. Julian's breath hitched violently in his throat. He stopped 3 paces away from her, terrified to cross the invisible line she maintained on the wet sand. "Sophie," he rasped, his voice rough and grating over the sound of the crashing surf. The fever is gone. The dark magic in my blood, it is quiet. You saved me. You let me stay by the hearth. I extracted a poison that was actively driving a sovereign to feral madness," Sophie replied smoothly, her posture straight, her chin lifted in flawless dignity, though her gaze remained anchored to his hollowed face. "You were dying, Julian. I am a healer by nature, and I have spent my entire life learning how to draw the venom out of suffering things. I could not, in good conscience, allow the monarch of the Northern Territories to burn alive in the mud of my village. But saving your life does not instantly erase the reasons I had to leave it." Julian stared at her, the reality of her words settling into his bones. "The words at the feast," he whispered, the memory tasting like cold ash on his tongue. "You heard me." "I stood behind the heavy tapestry," Sophie said quietly, the memory of that night darkening the silver of her eyes. "I brought the wooden wolf to the balcony. I listened as you allowed your court to mock my quiet devotion as a pathetic joke. You tore the bond from my chest while I listened in the shadows, and then you laughed. I was poisoned," Julian begged, stepping closer, his massive hands trembling as he reached out, desperate to close the physical gap between them. Brandon Cole slipped the alchemical wine into my goblet to sever my empathy. They manipulated my beasts to force a strategic marriage with the Southern Territories. I did not mean those words, Sophie. I swear it on my life, I did not mean them. Sophie looked at his outstretched, trembling hands, and then she slowly looked up into his frantic, molten gold eyes. She did not step back, but she did not reach out to meet him. Her expression held a deep, lingering sorrow. "It does not matter what the poison made you say," she answered, her voice dropping into a solemn, elegiac register that carried over the freezing wind. "What matters is that you created a world where those words were entirely believable. You built a keep of freezing stone and isolation. You allowed Garrick Vance and the generals to dismiss my value. You allowed the court to thrive on cruelty. The poisoned wine did not invent your arrogance, Julian. It simply removed the polite mask you wore to hide it. The truth struck him with the devastating, undeniable force of an executioner's blade. He could not blame the dark magic for his failure. The alchemical venom had only amplified the toxic environment he had actively cultivated. He had assumed her absolute loyalty, believing she would simply wait in the shadows forever, oblivious to the political machinations of his court. He had wanted a shadow. Now he was entirely consumed by the dark. Julian's broad, scarred shoulders collapsed forward. The sheer, overwhelming reality of his permanent failure shattered the final remnants of his sovereign pride. He could not command her to love him. He could not order the fated bond to heal with a single touch. Julian Sterling, the most terrifying and powerful monarch in the realm, dropped directly to his knees on the freezing wet sand. The impact sent a violent splash of icy seawater over his ruined leather trousers, but he did not feel the cold. The ocean surf rushed in, swirling aggressively around his heavy boots, pulling the sand out from beneath his knees, destabilizing him completely. He did not brace himself. He let the ocean batter him. He looked up at her, his grey eyes completely raw, tears mingling freely with the freezing salt spray on his hollowed cheeks. "I will abdicate the throne," Julian wept, his voice a guttural, tearing sound of pure, unadulterated agony that made his inner wolf howl in the dirt. "I will strip the iron crown from my head and throw it into this ocean. I will never return to the Northern Keep. Let me stay here, Sophie. Let me haul the fishing nets. Let me scrub the docks. I will sleep in the dirt outside your door. I will be your shadow. Just let me stay." With a trembling, blood-stained hand, Julian reached deep into the pocket of his ruined tunic. He pulled out the two splintered parts of the ruined carving. He held the broken pieces up to her, his massive hands shaking violently, offering the physical manifestation of his broken soul as a pathetic, desperate tribute. "I have carried it every single day since I found it on the stone steps," he begged, the ocean waves crashing relentlessly against his kneeling form. "Every mile in the snow, every night in the rain. It is the only thing that kept me breathing. Please, Sophie, I am a monster begging for a leash. Do not send me back into the dark." The freezing ocean wind whipped her dark hair across her cheek. Sophie did not smile. She did not revel in his destruction. Her heart simply felt incredibly, profoundly heavy with the weight of all the seasons they had lost to his pride. The weary caution she had carried from the hearth finally began to give way to the overwhelming evidence of his true, desperate remorse. For a long time, the only sound was the violent crashing of the southern tide and the ragged, desperate breathing of the broken man before her. His massive frame shuddered. The cold salt water soaked entirely through his ruined leathers, yet he refused to rise. He remained anchored in the shifting, abrasive sand, offering his absolute surrender to a woman who possessed no title, no vast armies, and no iron crown. She stared at the two broken halves of the shattered wooden wolf, resting in his massive, scarred palms. The intricate carvings she had spent weeks detailing by the light of the hearth were stained with his blood and dirt. It was a visceral, devastating reminder of the night she had burned the aronia blossom in her fireplace and vanished into the heavy snow. Yet, as she looked at the splinters piercing his skin, she did not see the arrogant sovereign who had mocked her behind the heavy tapestries. She saw the vulnerable, bleeding beast beneath the armor. Sophie was very good at being unseen, she murmured quietly, the wind catching the words and carrying them over the crashing waves. That is what I had to be to survive in your castle. I had to flatten myself against the walls. I had to hide my voice. I had to shrink my spirit down until it could fit inside a quiet room while your court paraded its power. Julian closed his eyes, a fresh wave of tears carving clean tracks through the mud and salt on his face. He bowed his head, unable to bear the unyielding truth in her storm-glass gaze. But the people of this village see me, Julian, she continued, her voice gaining a resonant, unshakable strength. The fishermen see the scribe who protects their livelihoods. The women see the friend who helps them mend their nets. I am no longer a shadow. I am a living, breathing woman who deserves a hearth that is already warm, not one I have to build from the ashes of my own humiliation. I will build the fire, Julian cried out desperately, his hands clutching the shattered pieces of wood so tightly that fresh blood welled beneath his fingernails, mixing with the salt water. I will build it, I swear to you. I will cut the timber, I will carry the stone, I will spend the rest of my days ensuring you never feel the cold again. Sophie stood absolutely still, the fated mate bond, the sacred thread of molten gold that had been resting quietly in the deep cavern of her chest, suddenly gave a violent, involuntary pulse. It was a raw, primal reaction to the absolute submission of her mate. The alchemical venom had been neutralized, yes, but the deeper sickness, the pride, the isolation, the armor of Ashenir, had finally been completely shattered against the southern rocks. She stepped forward slowly, deliberately. Her canvas boots sank into the wet sand, erasing the final boundary she had drawn between them. Julian gasped, his tempestuous eyes flying open, wide with a terrifying, desperate hope. He did not dare to move. He did not dare to breathe. Sophie slowly lowered herself, her knees pressing into the freezing, abrasive sand right in front of him. The ocean surf rushed in, swirling aggressively around them both, a chaotic baptism in the freezing coastal waters. She reached out, her small, calloused hands, stained with the ink of the cargo manifest and roughened by the harsh survival of the coast, gently covered his massive, trembling fists. The moment their skin connected, a blinding, physical shockwave of pure golden heat exploded through the freezing air. Julian's inner beast let out a deafening, euphoric howl that rattled the very marrow of his bones. The dormant thread of the fated mate bond reignited with the terrifying intensity of a dying star going supernova. The agonizing hollow void in his chest was instantly flooded with a rushing, consuming warmth. The cold sea spray seemed to evaporate against his skin. His breath caught in his throat as the biological certainty of their connection anchored him to the earth with absolute permanence. Sophie gently pried his bruised fingers open, rescuing the two pieces of the shattered wooden wolf from his frantic grip. She did not throw them into the sea. She cradled the broken fragments against her own chest, pressing the stained wood directly over her heart. "You cannot stay here as a king," Sophie whispered, her voice dropping into a solemn, intimate register that was meant only for him. "There is no room in this mud for iron crowns or royal decrees. If you stay as a man. You stay to haul the heavy nets. You stay to scrub the salt from these wooden floors. You stay to learn what it means to be small in a world of teeth." Julian stared at her, his heart hammering a frantic, joyous rhythm against his ribs. The devastating fear of permanent isolation melted away beneath the radiant, unwavering heat of her silver eyes. "I am yours," Julian rumbled, his voice thick with raw emotion and absolute devotion. "I have always been yours. You can have the crown. You can have the fortress. I only want the hearth." Sophie's rigid shoulders finally softened completely. The cautious guard she had maintained since he woke slowly melted away, revealing the gentle, fiercely loyal woman who had always been there, waiting beneath the frost. She lifted one hand and gently brushed a wet, dark strand of hair away from his hollowed cheek, her thumb tracing the line of his jaw. It was a simple, quiet gesture of profound intimacy. "Then get up from the mud, Julian," Sophie said softly, a genuine, breathtaking warmth returning to her voice. The tide is coming in, and the fire in the fisherman's hut will not build itself. Julian let out a ragged, breathless laugh. He turned his face into her palm, pressing a desperate, reverent kiss against her calloused skin. He had lost everything his toxic court valued, and in return, he had gained the entire world. He slowly rose to his feet, pulling his beautiful, resilient mate up with him from the freezing surf. The village women watched from the distant dunes, their fear replaced by a quiet, protective awe as they witnessed the terrifying monarch of Ashenir completely tamed by the gentle touch of their beloved scribe. They turned away from the vast, turbulent ocean and walked slowly back toward the dilapidated wooden hut. The wind was still biting, and the path ahead was fraught with the agonizing, necessary work of true healing. But as Julian Sterling walked beside the woman who held the shattered pieces of his soul, the corrosive ice in his veins was finally replaced by the enduring golden heat of home. The shadows were gone. The morning had finally arrived. Thank you for joining our sanctuary tonight and listening to this story of quiet survival, deep betrayal, and ultimate redemption. When Sophie stood on that freezing beach and forced the terrifying monarch to earn his place in the mud, she proved that true power lies in dignity, not a crown. Do you think Julian's public submission was enough to atone for his arrogant words in the castle? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. I read every single one. If you felt the warmth of this story, please take 2 seconds to like this video and subscribe to our channel to keep the hearth fire burning. We will see you in the next tale.